Welcome back to AJS101, Introduction to Criminal Justice. I am Dr. John Kavanaugh, and this is Lesson 10, Part 1. This chapter is about probation, parole, and community service. Community corrections is a sentence that moves away from incarceration and into the community using resources available there. Community corrections includes probation, parole, house arrest with electronic monitoring, and community service. Probation is a sentence of imprisonment that is suspended so the defendant can return to the community with various conditions that include supervision by a probation officer. John Augustus was the founder of probation. In the 1850s in Boston, he went to courts and agreed to bail out convicted persons, take them to his home, and reform them. And he was quite successful. As a result, later, governments all over the United States hired salaried probation officers to supervise and reform persons convicted of crimes, although not necessarily in their own homes. Probationers who violate the conditions of probation can be resentenced to serve their sentence. Today, probation is the most common sentence. And at the beginning of 1997, over 3 million adults were on probation in the United States. So a big part of probation are the conditions that it places upon the probationer. All people on probation get the general conditions, and that would be to obey the law. You can't reoffend. You also have to maintain employment because that keeps you productive and gives you a means to live on rather than, say, theft. You must also remain within the court's jurisdiction. Now, you can move out of a jurisdiction, but only with the permission of the court. And when that occurs, you usually have to have the probation department in the state or the county that you're moving to agree to take up your supervision. And most probation departments do have those sort of reciprocal agreements. You also have to agree to not possess weapons, and you must allow the probation officer to visit your home and place of employment to check up on you. Those are the general conditions that everybody on probation has to obey. There are also special conditions if they apply in a particular case. So, you may have to pay restitution if there's a victim and you cause that victim some loss of money or what have you. If you're believed to be addicted to drugs, drug testing might be a special condition of probation. If you were a pedophile or child molester, you may have to stay away from children. If you victimized somebody, terrorized them, assaulted them, raped them, you have to stay away from the victim. If you have no skills, which may be one reason why you turn to crime, then perhaps job training would be a special condition. And if you are a repeat high-risk drunk driver, then surrendering one's driver's license could be a special condition. All right, that's probation. And remember, probation is in lieu of going to jail or prison. We also have parole. Parole is early release from prison back into the community under conditions, just like with probation, but under the supervision of a parole officer, because you're on parole. Parole is an administrative decision usually made by a parole board, as opposed to probation, which is a judicial decision made by a judge. Parole eases inmates back into society, and it also encourages good behavior while in prison, because you won't be released early for parole if you have a lot of discipline problems. Parole was started in 1876 in New York State as part of a reform movement to rehabilitate prisoners, and they used indeterminate sentences and early release on parole. Remember, parole is part of the medical model, which says that prisoners are ill and they need to be treated. So because you don't know how long the treatment will take, you have to give a range of the sentence, 5 to 8 years. So if after 5 years in prison, the parole board says, oh, this prisoner seems to be cured, they're released and then they're supervised for the remainder of their sentence. If after 5 years they're deemed not to be cured, they have to stay another year, and they then go back before the parole board to see if they can be released, only to be finally released in the end at the end of the range of the indeterminate sentence. Parole is losing popularity with the realization that we are not rehabilitating prisoners, and of course the new preference for determinate sentences. At the beginning of 1997, over 700,000 people were on parole in the U.S. A significant number, but obviously not as popular as probation. Many states have abolished parole. There were some very high-profile cases of parolees released early from prison who, while out, raped or murdered people. And that soured people to parole, and many states abolished parole. Arizona abolished parole. Although the prosecutors found a workaround, and they began getting prisoners sentenced to jail followed by probation, which is kind of really the same thing, almost. Okay, what are the conditions? Well, just like with probation, in parole you have the same general conditions everybody has to subscribe to, and based on the prisoner, there will also be special conditions, be it drug testing, anger management classes, or what have you. And parolees who violate parole may be sent back to prison to serve the rest of their sentence. All right, let's talk about probation and parole, pros and cons. What are the pros, the arguments for probation and parole? Well, the first would be low cost. It costs a lot less money to have one probation or one parole officer supervise 20, 30, 40, 50 people than to have all those people in cells. They also enable the defendant to work and support his or her family. If you throw a person into jail or prison, they can't work, and if the family doesn't have other resources, then they may wind up on welfare. It also allows a defendant to pay restitution to the victim. While in jail or prison, prisoners who work might make 25 cents an hour, hardly enough to pay restitution to their victim. If they're still on the street, they can have regular jobs with much better pay, so they can, in fact, do some restitution. Probation and parole allows the defendant to experience positive community relations with family and friends. They don't go into a jail or prison where they only hang out with criminals and become institutionalized and more ingrained in the criminal subculture. Probation and parole also reduce the risk of criminal socialization. As I just said, they're in the community and not in jail or prison with criminals. And in the community, there's increased use of community services for education and rehabilitation. As we have mentioned earlier, the opportunities for education and treatment, psychological, medical, what have you, in jails and prisons is very limited. Whereas out in the society, there are many such opportunities and resources. So if the person is staying in the community, there's a lot more community services for education and rehabilitation than in a jail or prison. But what are the cons, no pun intended, the downside of probation and parole? Well, one is the lack of punishment. Many people think that not going to jail or prison lets them off too easy. And there's also the increased risk to the community. If you're in jail or prison, you're not going to victimize if you recidivate somebody else. Whereas if you're in the community, you might commit more crimes against people. All right, let's talk about the job of probation officers and parole officers. And remember, they're very similar. They're both supervising criminals, right? And also counseling them. All right, so probation officers prepare pre-sentence reports to aid judges in sentencing. So that's one thing that a probation officer does. Probation officers also sometimes get involved in dispute resolution between defendants and victims. Trying to bring them together, work out voluntary restitution, sometimes even avoid criminal charges if it's a minor case. Both probation officers and parole officers will diagnose the defendant's problems, and they make an assessment of what type of conditions and programs will help the defendant. So they're going to look at the court papers and other files, maybe interview the person, and basically say, what services does this person need? Medical services, mental, educational, and make sure that the probationer or parolee gets into those services. and of course, education. In addition, probation and parole officers supervise the probationers and parolees, right, to ensure compliance with the conditions of probation and parole, and to also counsel and guide them, help them cope with release back into society. What are the difficulties? Well, probation and parole officers walk the fine line between counselor and supervisor. As a counselor, they're supposed to work as social workers, helping the person adjust, steering them to the right resources for education and rehabilitation. But as a supervisor, they're supposed to make sure that they comply with the conditions of probation and parole. So they're more like a cop. And these two roles conflict. Now, some people think that being both counselor and supervisor, social worker and cop, is good. This is the carrot and the stick. The probation or parolee, because they know that the officer has such power to send them back to prison or jail, they will be more willing to obey the conditions of probation and parole. Others say the conflict is difficult, it creates a lack of trust between the two, and it makes it harder for the probation or parole officer to counsel and help the person because they're also the cop. I think overall people think it's a benefit to have both things. Another difficulty in these jobs is heavy caseloads combined with limited training and time constraints. Ideally, you might have maybe 20 people to supervise if you're a probation or parole officer, but budget cuts and the fact that giving money to help criminals is not high on most legislative budget wish lists has created situations where one officer may have to supervise 30, 40, or even 50 people. And that's very stressful, and they really can't do a good job under those circumstances, and they often will burn out. And also, a lack of upward mobility in small offices. If you're in a small probation or parole office, then there may only be one or two supervisors. And if they're young and they're not going to retire or get themselves promoted, then you really have no place to climb upward in a small office. And this can also be frustrating. And this, by the way, also applies to police departments or any kind of an organization. If you're in a small company, the variety of positions you can work in, specialized jobs, is limited or non-existent, and you may have no opportunity to advance. So always keep that in mind when you're looking for work. Small agencies may be quaint, but they can often stifle careers, especially the careers of people who are very upwardly mobile. Okay, that's the end of Lesson 10, Part 1. And now you can go on to Lesson 10, Part 2.